Welcome to my channel. This is an indication of some of the things that I cover on a regular basis in my videos. If you haven't already subscribed, please feel free to do so, and don't forget to click the little bell so that you'll get notified of future videos. Please feel free to share my videos on your social media, and I hope you enjoy the video which follows. Well, on the 23rd of March, this is where this saga continues with video number 2 here, I took a train from Velletri back to Rome, Termini, the main train station, and from there I caught a train to Arezzo, which is the closest train station to the farm that I will be staying on for the next 3 weeks. The farm is called Val di Pozzo, which you can see on that sign there, and that is the Valley of the Well. A pozzo is a well, and they've owned the land for 3 years, and they still haven't found the well that it refers to. But that was the name of the farm when they bought it, so they kept the name. Private land, and the white line across a red circle there just basically means no trespassing. And attention. La cane there, I don't speak Italian, but that just beware of the dog. Well, there's a story there. The man of the house, Fabrizio, picked me up at the train station and drove me fair distance, 20-minute, half-hour drive, up into the mountains where the farm is. And along the way, he asked me a couple of times if I was afraid of dogs, and I said, no, not afraid of dogs. Then he said, are you afraid of Alsatians, which is what we call a German Shepherd here? And I said, well, no, not particularly. Well, he said, we have an Alsatian, but you won't have to worry about it. He said, I locked it in the house before I left, so it won't be out when we arrive. I'm beginning to worry just a bit. There was a plumber doing work at the house, and he didn't want the dog to be bothering the plumber, so that was why it was locked in the house. So we arrive. It's a beautiful house. As I said, they've owned it about 3 years, and it was a complete derelict when they purchased it. It had been abandoned since the end of the Second World War, and had been vandalized. People came and knocked down part of one of the buildings on the property, I presume to get the building stone and whatever. But they have turned it into an absolutely beautiful home. You can see the tail end of the van there. That's the plumber's van. Not quite sure what was happening with the 2 doors open. I was probably taking my things into it. Once again, I have an apartment. The first door to the left that's open, that goes up the stairs to their home. They live on the entire top floor. The bottom floor is divided into 3 or 4 small apartments. They plan to do agritourism also, and I was given one of the apartments. The door on the right there was my apartment. However, the dog was still in the house when I arrived, so he warned me again. He went and let the dog out. And it's a German Shepherd. It's absolutely foolish. It came barreling out of the house, ran all around the property, ran by me 2 or 3 times till I bent down and grabbed it and started rubbing its head. And I looked up at Fabrizio and I said, well, there are Alsatians, and then there's your Alsatian, which is crazy. The next couple of photographs are taken up on the terrace. Terraces, I guess, if that's the plural. It was a terraced farm at one time, and they're trying to turn it back into one again. And one of my jobs, my major job, I guess, while I'm there, would be digging holes in the terraces and planting olive trees. They've already planted small fruit trees, which, well, by now, this was 2007, so by now they're probably yielding quite well. Hopefully the olive trees that I planted are doing the same. But Fabrizio, who is the man of the house, as I said, prefers to be called Fab, so I will refer to him hopefully as Fab in the rest of this. He is a professor at the University of Siena. His specialty is, I want to say architecture. He's not an architect, though. He's an expert in Renaissance art and architecture, so I'm not quite sure what you call his profession, but he lectures at the University of Siena, and since then he was almost ready to publish a book when I was there, and he has published a book called Siena, Constructing the Renaissance City. I have a copy of it. I bought it after I found out that it had been published. Anyway, the family was Fab and his wife Tony, and they have two daughters. Clara, the older of the two daughters, I don't know, young teenager, and a preschool daughter whose name was Gaialusha. A lovely family. I felt welcomed and like I'd always been there within hours. We had a long dinner that evening and talked about all sorts of things. The buildings that you're looking at, just about to switch there, I guess. The first building that you see is still under construction. It was a barn at one time, and his uncle is restoring that. I presume that's completely finished now, and his uncle's probably living in it. And the other one is, look at the first picture that I showed, is their home. And as I said, it's going to be for agritourism. They will have guests staying in the lower levels of it. These are just a few photos that I took my first day there. Some of the views from the farm. You look down directly on the little village of Falciano, and then off to the left further is Subiano, and beyond that is the larger town of Arezzo. There's a bit of a story about the snow-capped mountains here. Earlier on in the winter, when I was corresponding with both of the farms, trying to determine which one I would go to first, I was corresponding with either Tony or Fab, one or the other. I think Tony, if I'm not mistaken, but anyway, I was thinking about coming in early February, and the reply came that, well, you're welcome to come in early February, but there'll probably still be snow here. They're up at altitude. Down in the valley there wouldn't be any snow, but also if the ground were frozen I wouldn't be able to do any digging or anything. But as soon as they said snow, I replied and said, oh no, you just said the S word. That's what I'm trying to get away from. I'm here in Canada. I don't want to encounter snow. So I chose the first farm in Velletri to go to. But from that day on, the joke has been the S word. When the next day, the second day that I was there, Fab went to Arezzo, to a huge co-op store, wonderful grocery store, and I would be cooking my breakfast and lunch and having dinner with them every day, but the other two meals I would be cooking myself, so I went along to do some grocery shopping. And on our way down, to get down to Arezzo, you go down off of their mountain, up onto another mountain, and down off of that to get to the highway to Arezzo. On the second mountain, we encountered a snowstorm. I was a bit nervous about it. It's all these switchback, little narrow dirt road with snow and getting slippery, but he navigated it very well. But every time snow came up or anything, they would just look at me and laugh and say the S word. The wonderful views from the terraces where I would be working, I knew immediately that I was going to have a difficult job because I would be looking at that view constantly. Absolutely gorgeous. And I think later on I might have a photo or two which shows the river off in the distance. It's the Arno River, and it's winding its way through this valley on its way to Florence. I know in the first video I said I didn't want to show pictures of any of them because I didn't have permission to show pictures, but I figure this could be anybody because it doesn't show his face, but that is Fab, and he's cooking sausages in the fireplace, which seemed to be their main source of heat. I don't know what I had down below. I didn't really need heat, I guess. I was always quite comfortable. Food was wonderful once again. And they sort of took turns cooking. Tony cooked, and he would come home from university some days, and he would do the cooking. Whoever did the cooking, the meals were always wonderful. once again, very accommodating to having a vegetarian in their house. It was always lovely vegetarian meals for me. I had never had nettle pie before. Tony made nettle pie for me a couple of times. It was really good. It's almost like a spinach quiche, I guess. It's quiche-like anyway, and the greens in it are nettles. I'll try to let a few slides go by now without talking forever about each one. This is above the door that went up to their residence on the second floor. This is a picture of my doorway with the flowers outside and whatever. Close-up of the flowers. It was nice to see those early in the spring. The building that they're living in is on the right. The one on the left is the one that's still under construction. But that piece in between, you can see what I mean about there was some destruction done before they bought the property. 3 demijohns in the garden. Their rooster, Chanticleer. Chanticleer just happens to be the name of the only breed of Canadian chickens, but he was not a Chanticleer. His name was Chanticleer. One of their hens off in the flowers and grass, enjoying itself. The farm is in the middle, or surrounded by anyway, the Tuscan National Forest, which is almost entirely a forest of chestnut trees, been managed since the Middle Ages, first by the church and now by the government. These things, I was told, was where they used to store chestnuts. The poorer folk would gather up the chestnuts in the fall and put them in these to dry, and then evidently they were shelled and ground into a flour to cook with. Nobody is maintaining them or anything, but they're still in great condition, and ran across them everywhere when I was hiking in the forest. And obviously I was quite taken with them. I took pictures of them every time I saw one. One of the trails. There are literally hundreds of kilometers of well-maintained and managed trails throughout the National Forest. They're maintained by local volunteer hiking groups. And my afternoons off, or my evenings off, or sometimes on my weekend off, I went for long hikes in the forest. Didn't have much rain while I was there, but there was still a lot of little brooks running everywhere. The only danger in the forest, I never really encountered one face to face, was the wild boar. I heard them down lower below me in the forest different times, but I unfortunately never did actually get to see one. And their German Shepherd Alsatian adopted me. It would go with me everywhere I went. When I worked all day up on the terraces, it spent the day with me. If I threw a stone that I didn't want in the hole that I was digging, it would go get that and carry it around its mouth by the hour. Well, Tony told me that if you're taking the dog with you on the trail and you encounter a wild boar, it will chase the wild boar away. But that is your clue, she said, to climb a tree. That's Subiano down below the farm. Because he will only chase the boar for a few minutes, and then his herding instinct will take over. He'll turn it around and bring the boar back to you. So luckily we didn't encounter one. I don't know, that cabin had no road going into it or anything, just someone's cabin in the forest. And all of the trails are marked like this, with red over white paint on posts, so that you know you're still on one of the managed trails. Everything was just starting to come alive. The trees were starting to leave out. Down in the valley, they were already leaved out. Almond trees were in bloom, but up in the mountains where it's cooler, they were just starting to get their foliage. And the forest, as I say, is managed. That is where a chestnut tree was cut down a few years ago, and it sends up all of those stems. Well, they go in and they select the better of the stems and let them grow, and it's grown on a 30-year cycle. This section here was being harvested. It had grown for 30 years, and that's all of the wood piled up there. While I was there, Fab bought a couple of loads, and I had the pleasure of stacking it in his wood pile. This is the wood pile with the rainbow going down. It said the pot of gold is somewhere in the wood pile. And this is the wonderful dog. Clara was a bit upset, I think. It's really her dog. They got the dog before Lucia was born. And as I said, the dog adopted me. I would go up for dinner, and it would be after 10 o'clock or later before dinner was over, and I would go down to my apartment. And within a few minutes, the dog would be down, and he didn't come in, but he would sleep on the little doorstep outside of my apartment. Fab told me that there was just no way of keeping it upstairs. After I had gone, it would whine and bark until they let it out again. There it is in the morning, sleeping outside my door. Well, Clara, I don't think, liked that idea because I had taken over her dog, but I couldn't help it. I liked it just as much as it liked me. And this is one of the cats. They had two cats, and one of them sort of moved in with me, too. I didn't leave it in there in the daytime when I was gone, but it loved to come in, curl up on the sofa. Well, the collection of pictures that follows here are mostly of Falciano, the tiny village down below the farm. That particular view there, though, is Subiano, the larger town. But I just want to let them go by, and I want to talk for just a moment or two here about my work on the farm. A lot of it was very hard work. Thankfully, I only had to work half a day most days. Some days I did end up working the entire day. I was alone a lot. Children were gone. I've been reading my journal is where all this information is coming from. I'm a journal keeper. I write in a journal every evening and have for many years, and I had one of my journals with me. First, I was saying that Lucia, the youngest, was preschool. I think she must have at least been in kindergarten because both girls were gone during the day. And Tony, the mother, she taught, but not like a 5-day-a-week job, I'm not sure. She taught at a school somewhere, but it seemed like it was only a day or two a week. And of course, Fab was gone every day. He was a professor at the University of Siena. So a lot of the time I was working alone. When Fabrizio was home, he would work on the terraces, and I would work with him. He used a chainsaw. The terraces were overgrown, hadn't been touched in 50 years, and he would be cutting down shrubs and trees and brush and whatever that had grown there, and I would be dragging it away and piling it up, and a couple of different days we had large bonfires and burnt that sort of stuff. When I was there alone, I was digging holes in the terraces where fruit trees and olive trees would be planted. And this, as I said, this soil had not been worked in 50 years, so it was heavy sod. I think I dug around 30 holes for trees, and each hole had to be about 3 feet wide and close to 2 feet deep. And the sod was so hard, it would take me an hour or more to dig each hole. Once I finished that, I had to go back and dig smaller holes in between the larger ones where herbs would be planted. So that kept me busy for a long time. And then there were existing gardens that I had to weed and do a lot of hoeing around that hadn't been attended in a year or more. So there was a lot of work to do. I just what's coming up here are trips that I took to Siena a couple of times with Fabrizio when he went to work. He would take me along with him, and I'd spend the day or part of a day, if he was only going to be there part of a day, exploring Siena. I also was dropped off. They were going somewhere, and I was dropped off in Arezzo on one of the days that there is a antique market. The first Monday, I think it is, of every month, there is a world-famous antiques market in Arezzo, and the entire town turns into a market. Antique sellers coming from all over, and people come from all over the world to buy there. So that was a very interesting day. And once I took a trip to Florence, and there will be pictures of those coming up. That was just a quick day trip, a few hours in Florence, and then back home on the train. So that's just a little explanation of what's coming up. I didn't want it to seem like I was just there traveling around, enjoying myself, and staying at the farm. There was a lot of work to be done on the farm. So one day, Fab wanted to know if I'd like to go with him, spend the day in Siena. I had never been to Siena before. I've been to Florence. It's a smaller scale, much smaller town, but in many ways quite similar. They're both Renaissance towns. This is the town square, the main piazza in the center of the town, tower and the government buildings. A fountain, beautifully carved. It's also in the town square. It was working. That's sort of I think that's the same she-wolf that raised Romulus and Remus, the mythological characters that are supposed to have founded the city of Rome. I was so fascinated, though, with this fountain. The sculpture work on it was just incredible. What I like about both Siena and Florence is the little narrow streets. Every one of them is always something interesting at the end of it, and all kinds of interesting shops along the street. This was a shop that sold mostly wine, I think. Those stack of small jars appears to be truffles, and the fox appears to be having a quail or something for dinner. This place was so beautiful, but it was ham and cheese and all the produce of Tuscany. The bicycle out in front of the window I thought was interesting. And while I was standing there taking that photograph, a lady come along. I think she was trying to figure out what she might go in and buy for lunch. The Duomo, or Cathedral, of Siena, not as large or as impressive as the one in Florence, but nevertheless a beautiful building. The interior. This icon in the cathedral is called the Virgin of the Vow, VOW. There's a beautiful sort of library area attached with wonderful frescoes on the walls and lots of illuminated texts, beautiful books. And of course, I had pizza for lunch, and this is the guy who made it. I didn't get a photograph of it when he was throwing it up in the air, but it was delicious. This particular church, I don't seem to have any photographs of the interior, but the famous saint of Siena is Catherine of Siena. And if you read in the guidebooks, it says that there is a reliquary in there with St. Catherine of Siena's head in it. And I thought, well, it will just be a box, on an altar somewhere. Well, it was, but it was made of glass. And there was the shrunken head of St. Catherine with her nun's veil on and whatever. I was not terribly impressed. The legend or story of St. Catherine is that during the Great Schism, when the Pope moved to Avignon in France, and several popes succeeded him and stayed in Avignon for, I don't know, 150 years or more, that St. Catherine went to uh, Avignon and met with the Pope and convinced him to return to Rome. Well, on the way home from this trip to Siena, I, of course, got questioned by Fab wanting to know what I saw and what I learned because he is an expert on everything in Siena, of course. And I told him about seeing St. Catherine's head, and he said, "What do you know about her?" And I told him about the story about she went to Avignon to convince the Pope to move back to Rome, and they moved. He sort of smiled. He said, "Yes, I suppose in a way that is true." He said she did go and she did meet with the Pope, but they certainly thought about it for a while. It was 100 years later before they moved back to Rome. After talking for quite a while about the different things that I saw in Siena, Fab sort of apologized and said, "I'm sorry, I know I must be boring you to death." And I said, "No, not at all. A lot of people pay money to hear these lectures. I'm getting it for free. More of the little narrow streets, I just love them." And this is a statue of Romulus and Remus being raised by the she-wolf. Very surprised to find it there because tradition says that they were uh, in Rome, not in Siena, and I'm sure that Fab explained that to me on the way back, but I don't recall what he said. And the next one is no great surprise to me. I saw these on street corners, and it is what you think it is, in various cities in Europe. I've even had to use them. My question is, where do the women go? Back on the farm and digging holes for more olive trees, about a foot down, I came across an unused World War II bullet. That's I put it next to the little cell phone that I was using over there to give you some idea of the size of it. Italy, of course, does not have a great reputation for World War II, the fascist government and Mussolini and whatever, but there was an active resistance, and particularly in the area of the farm, the resistance was very active. Just outside of the farm gate, there is a shrine to St. Rita. St. Rita is the patron saint of lost causes. The story goes that a group of the resistance were being chased or tracked down by the Gestapo in this area, and one of them, or several of them, prayed to St. Rita, and a fog descended, heavy fog, and the Gestapo didn't find them. Uh, they walked right on past them because they were hidden in the fog. Well, after the war was over, you'll see a plaque here eventually, in 1954, that group of men made a shrine to St. Rita and placed it in the spot where they were hiding, which happens to be just outside of the farm gate. And every year, on the feast day of St. Rita, whenever that is, a pilgrimage comes up from the town of Falciano down below. It would have to be the descendants of those men now, I would assume. If not, they would probably wouldn't. If they're still alive, they wouldn't be walking up the mountain. They'd be well into their 90s. But I thought that was very interesting. The family was going somewhere for the day, so they dropped me off in Arezzo, and I spent the day exploring the town. I hadn't actually been there other than to some stores. I think this is like the town hall, which has the bell tower attached to it. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But it was the first antiques market for the time that I was there anyway. Very interesting. There was, well, I didn't buy anything. I probably couldn't afford a lot of it, but how would I get it home anyway? Stalls everywhere, not all selling antiques, but of course everybody takes advantage of the crowd, and there were food stalls and handiwork and all of that sort of thing, but a great deal of antiques, some of which would be considered yard sale stuff and some of which were very, very valuable antiques. It's a bit of the bell tower in the background there, to to the left. I did a lot of enjoying, but unfortunately didn't buy. Many things I would like to have bought, but how on earth would I get them back home? On a weekend, on one of my days off, I took a train trip to Florence for the day. I had been in Florence once before. I love the city. What you're looking at there to the left, that sort of octagon-shaped building, that's the baptistery. And the building opposite, across the other side of the street, of course, is the cathedral, which they call a Duomo. And the bronze panels in the doors to the baptistery are famous, done by Lorenzo Ghiberti. Michelangelo was so impressed with them that he called them the gates of paradise. The panels that you see there now are reproductions. The originals, I think, are in the Uffizi Art Gallery and Museum. In the late 1970s, there was a terrific flood in Florence. Two of the panels got removed from the doors and swept downriver somewhere and have never been found. So they removed the rest of them and replaced them all with reproductions. Inside the Duomo, some of the most interesting cathedral or church candle holders that I've ever seen. It was Holy Week, the week between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. So there were lots of candles lit inside of the cathedral. These are the statues that are outside of the Uffizi. I have never yet managed to get inside. I've been, as I say, to Florence twice. The lineup for tickets is a mile long and doesn't seem to move. If you're going to get in the museum, you really need to buy your tickets in advance. These statues are also reproductions. That's Michelangelo's David. Some of the other ones I knew at the time from a guide, but the guidebook that I had, what the names of them were, but they're all reproductions. The originals are inside the museum. I love these things. These are street performers. I've never seen them over here anywhere in North America. Maybe they exist, but I've seen them in many cities in Europe. They stand perfectly still usually, and there's a box down below them to put coins in. When you put a coin in, they will move. Sometimes they bow to you, sometimes they throw you a kiss. You never know quite what they might be going to do, but I'm always fascinated by them. They must make good money in it because they never stop. You see them everywhere. That's the Ponte Vecchio across the Arno. It is shops from one end to the other, mostly gold and jewelry shops. I didn't go in. I was scared I would probably buy something for a lot of money. This one is an antique jewelry shop. People window shopping. I think that's what most people do. It's tourists like me, and I think most everybody is just there window shopping. Obviously, they make enough money to stay in business, though. They've been there for many years. The guy dressed fancy with the leather bag who looks like he's walking down the Ponte Vecchio, he isn't. He's absolutely motionless. The rest of us are walking. It was a fashion shoot. He was a model for some sort of a fashion company, and there was photographers taking pictures of him. More of the lovely, narrow streets with a treasure at the end of every one and wonderful shops along the way. When I was in Florence years before this, down one of these little streets, I found a shop selling just Tuscan things, which you find lots of these kind of shops. This particular one sold very expensive wine, very expensive olive oil, and balsamic vinegar. I bought both balsamic vinegar and olive oil there in, well, quite a bit of money for each of them. They were so wonderful. I spent some time trying to find that shop again, and of course I couldn't find it this time. I'm sure it's there somewhere. I just didn't go down the right little narrow street. Back on the farm, it's still Holy Week, and I took this picture of the Easter full moon. If you don't know how Easter is calculated, it is done by the moon. It's a movable feast, as you probably know. Easter is not on the same date every year. Easter is the first Sunday following vernal equinox, the spring equinox, following the first full moon after vernal equinox. That isn't complicated enough, but that is how Easter is calculated. And in the lead up to Easter, uh, Fab took me to the shepherd's farm where he got the lamb for Easter dinner. And as he said, he got to know that lamb a lot better than he really wanted to. The shepherd hadn't slaughtered it when he showed up to pick it up, so he got to see it shot, not shot, but however it was killed and prepared before he could take away the carcass. For me, this was one of the highlights of my trip. I got to meet the shepherd and his wife, and they make cheese, ricotta cheese, and a solid cheese, which I assume would be something like pecorino romano, which is made with sheep's milk. They didn't have any. It was too early in the season. They just starting collecting milk, and they didn't have any cheese to buy. It was one of those times when I wish I spoke Italian. They were both such interesting people and obviously such nice people. I would love to have been able to converse with them. Did as much as possible with Fab acting as my translator. He was milking his sheep, and I will show you a picture of the shepherd here milking his sheep. I was surprised at how little milk you get out of each sheep. He was getting, I would say, around 2 cups of milk from a sheep. And he asked me, Fab had told him that I kept goats, or used to keep goats. He asked me if I got that much milk from a goat. And I tried to be as polite as possible, but I wouldn't keep a goat if it only gave 2 cups of milk. He did explain that later on in the spring, in May, when the pastures are better, the amount of milk does increase. Easter dinner was al fresco dining in the garden. This is a little bit of wood that Fab had burnt till it got down to hot coals, and he cooked the 2 legs of lamb over the hot coals. They had been rubbed with olive oil, garlic, and you can see some rosemary there. Of course, being a vegetarian, I didn't eat any of the lamb. I had nettle pie. They had a family visiting from England who has a home somewhere in Tuscany, not too far away, but friends of theirs came for Easter dinner, so I got to meet those people. It was all a very interesting day anyway. This concludes my stay on the farm, Valdepazzo. This is just some pictures of goats that I took in a little farm down below in the village of Felciano. I'll just use that as a background as I finish up the video here. I took the train from Arezzo to Milan, north to Milan, and then from Milan another train on to Paris. The second train, I was on it for 13 hours. My luggage couldn't fit in any rack where I was seated, and there was luggage racks by the door of the train, on my particular car of the train, and I could see them, so I sat where I could keep an eye on my luggage. I was afraid that somebody getting off the train would just grab my suitcase and be gone, and I wouldn't have anything. So I basically sat for the 13 hours and watched my luggage up a few times to go to the washroom or whatever. Was not a good idea. 2 days later, in my hotel in Paris, I had a pulmonary embolism. At least that's what we think it was, but that's a story for another time. I spent most of that day in a hospital in Paris and did recover from it, and it was a scary experience, but didn't turn out to be all that serious in the end, I guess. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this little visit to Tuscany, the cities and towns around where I stayed, and the farm. And I will conclude now and get this finally shut down. I hope it's not too terribly long. I know it's longer than the first part that I did.